Hello chess friends! In today's video we have a game from Chess.com's ongoing Speed Chess Championship in which Magnus Carlsen performs a surgical procedure on Maxime Vachier-Lagrave's position, but unlike a real surgeon whose goal is to help and to heal, Magnus Carlsen is tearing away the stitches and bandages holding MVL's precarious position together, until his king is fatally exposed and doomed to a checkmate in 5 moves. Magnus Carlsen is truly playing some of the best chess of his life, once again producing a blitz game of such accuracy that it looks like it could have easily been played with the classical time control. But enough said, please enjoy. Carlsen begins the game with d4. We got knight to f6 from MVL, knight to f3, g6, and here Carlsen plays the relatively rare knight b to d2. He's very good at avoiding any possible opening preparation from his opponent by selecting these variations which are not very popular, yet are highly playable and have a lot of logic to them. What's more common here for white is c4, g3, or bishop g5. But with this move knight b to d2, he is threatening to get the big center with e4. So MVL immediately plays d5, stopping e4. And now Carlsen plays an even rarer move. He plays b3, planning bishop to b2. Interestingly, b3 is the first choice of Stockfish at a depth of 44, but at a depth of 50, it likes b4 even better. Kind of a weird looking move, but I believe the thinking is you want to stop c5, which is a common pawn break for black in this opening. But after b3, MVL fianchettos his bishop to g7. Carlsen does the same with bishop to b2. We got bishop to f5 and e3. And you can see that although Carlsen played a line which is not very popular, he has achieved a nice coordination of his pieces. You know, the knights are defending each other. Got the open diagonal for the bishop. The only bad piece is this bishop on b2, staring at its own pawn. But if black ever wants to make a pawn break in the center with c5 or e5, that bishop can potentially come to life after the pawn is captured on e5 or c5. So this isn't a bad setup for white at all. MVL castles. We got bishop to e2. And now the knight drops into e4. Carlsen castles. And MVL strikes in the center with c5. Now Carlsen would love to take out that pawn and activate his bishop, but it's not possible for the moment as that bishop would be lost. So instead he hops onto a central square with his knight, knight to e5. MVL plays a developing move, knight to c6. Now in case you're wondering about taking the knight on e5, this is not good. After d takes e5, the dark squares around black's king are weak. This pawn is well defended by the bishop. This is not a good variation for black taking on e5. Knight c6 is the better move. And now we see some exchanges. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes c6, b takes c6. So Carlsen has succeeded in landing MVL some doubled pawns and would be able to win one of those pawns with d takes c5, if not for the fact that it would open the diagonal and he would lose his bishop on b2. This means that black will be able to take on d4 on the next move, ridding him of his doubled pawns, so Carlsen strengthens his center with c3. On the surface, it looks like it discourages black from taking on d4, because after c takes d4, c takes d4, black now has a weak backward c pawn, but of course he could push it to c5 right away, again, since this pawn's pinned and cannot take, or you're losing your bishop. Now I should point out that e takes d4 is not going to be as good here, since in this line white only has one central pawn, as opposed to 2 when you take with the c pawn. And the bishop is not hitting a central square. It's blocked by its c-pawn so that black could play e5 right away in this variation, as opposed to c takes d4. There's no e5 because the bishop is controlling that square with the pawn. So that's kind of why Carlsen played that move c3 so he could recapture with the c-pawn. That's superior here. But we don't go down this road in the game. MVL plays queen to a5 with maybe some future threat to the a-pawn. Carlsen pushes that pawn with a4. Now we have c takes d4. Carlsen could simply play c takes d4 here. And after c5, again you can't take here, but rook c1 is a fine move and the position's about equal. But Carlsen plays this interesting idea, b4. This sets up a pawn sacrifice. The queen's hit, so she moves to b6. Now there's an interesting line here that MVL could have went for, where you can sacrifice the queen. d takes c3. b takes a5, c takes b2. Threatening to get a queen, defended by the bishop, so best move is probably rook to b1, stopping that pawn, which means you're giving up the exchange. Bishop takes b1, queen takes b1, and after rook a to b8, black has a rook for the queen and a couple pawns, and although the computer initially thought this looked promising for black, after some deeper analysis it thinks it's pretty much equal. White is not going to be able to win this pawn, Since it's defended by the dark squared bishop and a rook, you can't attack it with the light squared bishop, and therefore white is going to have to be tied down to babysitting the pawn and making sure it doesn't turn into a queen. So that's an interesting line. Not sure if MVL even considered that option, but he played queen to b6. Now a5 from Carlsen. Hitting the queen again, and she drops back to b8. Now Carlsen does not have to sack a pawn here. He could take with the e-pawn, but again, this isn't great. This bishop is looking pretty bad, and black can get in the move e5. So he plays the better move, c takes d4, which takes protection off the b-pawn so that queen takes b4 is played. But this means we get bishop to a3 with tempo on the queen, which drops back to b7. You can't take the pawn on a5, obviously, because bishop takes e7, there's a discovered attack by the rook, and there's an attack on the rook on f8. That's losing for black. So queen b7, and black does have the extra pawn, but this c-pawn is weak, being backward, and there's no c5 anytime soon. There's no longer a pin on this pawn, since the bishop is no longer on b2. Here Carlsen plays queen to d2. A bit better would have been f3. Kicking the bishop back, and after bishop f5, g4, the bishop cannot stay on this diagonal, meaning after bishop d7, the rook can come to the open file, with tempo on the black queen. It weakens white's kingside a little bit, but apparently it's more important to contest black's control of the only open file. But instead Carlsen went for queen to d2, meaning MVL could have played h5 here, discouraging the f3 g4 plan, because if that's played after bishop f5 g4, you'd have h takes g4, f takes g4. Black has the option of bishop e4 since there's no pawn on f3 anymore, even though here the engine says bishop e6 is pretty good. And this pawn can be targeted with queen d7. This is inferior for white than the previous variation where the pawn was on f3. But in the game, h5 is not played. MVL places his rook behind his weak c-pawn, adding extra protection. Carlsen plays a good move, a6, placing that pawn one step closer to the promotion square with an attack on the queen, and it fixes this a7 pawn as a potential target. MVL plays queen to c7, and now Carlsen goes for the idea of kicking this bishop off its post with f3, bishop f5, g4, and MVL plays bishop to e6. Not sure why he chose e6 instead of d7. That would add more protection to the weak c-pawn. It would also not block the e-pawn, so that e5 could potentially be played. But okay, Carlsen plays rook a to b1. Now that there's no bishop on f5 to take it out, we got rook a to b8. Now bishop c5. Beautiful post for the bishop, eyeing that a7 pawn, meaning the queen is tied down to defending that pawn for the moment. Now here MVL gets very ambitious with h5. This turns out to be a blunder. He wants to get rid of this pawn on g4 so that he can put his bishop back to f5. After g takes h5, MVL plays bishop to f5 with an attack on the rook. Now here Carlsen could achieve a dead drawn position with rook takes b8, rook takes b8, capturing on g6, and after bishop takes g6, this maintains material equality, but black has control of the open file, and the engine said this is dead drawn. But Carlsen plays the best move here. He plays bishop d3, which is a pawn sacrifice, but it results in a winning position for white. The best chance for black here would be to take out the bishop, and after queen takes d3, grab the pawn, and hope to weather the storm. After king to h1, you can eliminate a pair of rooks, and white's going to take with the queen here, rook b8, queen c2, and the engine says that this is about a pawn in white's favor, due to the vulnerability of the black king along this file, and probably also due to the fact that this pawn's a big weakness. The bishop's hitting it, and the queen's tied down to defending. But in the game, MVL decides to get aggressive with the move e5, which is a blunder, which Carlsen punishes swiftly and virtually flawlessly, beginning with h takes g6. MVL responds with the best move, bishop takes g6. If you take with the f pawn, then there's bishop takes f5, g takes f5. This is worse because the black king has no cover now. After bishop takes g6, bishop takes g6 by Carlsen, f takes g6. Now at least there's one pawn in front of the black king. But Carlsen goes about targeting this pawn immediately with queen to g2. MVL defends with queen to f7. Now here Carlsen missed the most decisive move, which was queen to g4. The point to this move is that it's attacking the rook on c8, so that this rook is not free to move forward, meaning that rook to b7 is a threat, targeting a7. If the rook were to capture the rook, then black would lose the rook on c8. The queen on g4 also supports the move f5, so that if black moves the rook out of the view of the queen, White can play d takes e5, bishop takes e5, f4, and once the bishop moves, the computer's giving rook takes b8, and then f5. And black's in big trouble. White's attacking the g-pawn, and obviously this is running into a big problem. The queen's under attack. The black king is only shielded by this bishop, which is pinned, and this position is actually a transposition to what we saw in the game. After the move that Carlsen played, d takes e5, which is only inferior to queen to g4 because here black has the option of playing queen to f5, controlling the g4 square, with an attack on the rook on b1 by 2 pieces. So the engine's giving queen to a2, defending the rook, and white's still winning. Black can grab the pawn on e5, but rook b7 is a problem here, hitting the a pawn. If you take the rook, a takes b7 comes with an attack on the rook and an attack on the a pawn. Black will not survive this. But MVL did not play queen to f5. He just played the natural looking bishop takes e5, and this transposes to the variation we looked at before. After f4, bishop g7, now queen g4, eyeing the c8 rook. MVL plays rook e8, now rook takes, f5, with an attack on g6. MVL tries g takes f5. If you were to try to add protection to g6 with king h7, white has a number of winning moves. One nice line is bishop takes a7, and if you capture that bishop, you are running into big problems. After f takes g6 check, if you go to h6 with your king, there's going to be queen to h3 check, king takes, queen to f5 check, king h6, and rook f3. Mate will be unavoidable due to the threat of rook to h3. If instead you move your king to g8, there's going to be queen to e6 check, king h8, queen to h3 check, and unless you sack your bishop with bishop to h6, there's going to be a checkmate after king g8, queen h7 mate. So maybe taking the pawn was the best try. G takes f5, but after rook takes f5, hitting the queen, MVL throws in a check for good measure. The king goes to g2, he throws in another check, and Carlsen's able to tuck his king away on h3. No more checks for black. The black queen's hit, so queen c7 is played, keeping some defense of the bishop, which is pinned to the king. But at this point, Carlsen finds a very nice mate in 5. Take a few seconds and see if you can spot it. Rook to f8 check is the move, which compelled MVL to resign. Since there is no bishop takes rook, that bishop is pinned to the king, black must move to h7 with his king. There follows queen to h5 check. Bishop h6 is black's only legal move, and then we got queen f5 check. After which g7 is the only square for the king, but now the bishop gets involved with bishop d4 check, and black's only legal move would be to put his queen in the way, and then bishop takes e5 is check and mate. So that concludes this game and this video. If you enjoyed this content, please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.